Good morning, everybody. My name is Donagh Cagney. I am the editor for Energy, Environment and Transport in Euractiv here behind us. And I'm very glad to be moderating this session that's brought us all here today, organized by Eurogas with Euractiv as the media partner, all about ensuring the resilience in the European energy transition. And specifically, we're going to focus on a new study just released today that looks at the role that low carbon and renewable gases can play in the energy transition, and indeed once that transition is complete. You've all received copies of the agenda, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. Suffice to say that we have about an hour and a quarter for discussions. We're going to start off with a presentation from the authors of the study, who's going to take you through some of the methodology and the findings as well. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with some experts from a range of different perspectives. It's a panel discussion, but it's also a discussion with you guys as well. We have a full house today, and I know we have a lot of brains in this room packed full of experience and knowledge from policymaking in the energy transition as well. So I will be bringing you into that discussion, so you've been warned, be ready. And then I believe that if we behave ourselves, we will be rewarded with a free lunch around 13:45, so just over an hour's time. In terms of setting the scene, as I mentioned, this study and what we're here to talk about today is the role of low carbon and renewable gases in the energy transition. I hope I'm not giving a spoiler to the study from Frontier. We'll hear about the details very shortly. But a big part of the story, the study, is looking at the role of these gases, that these gases will play relative to electrification. In contrast to, in comparison to, in conjunction to, that's all to be discussed. But it is a big theme of today, I think, as well. And I suspect, having been involved in quite a few of these energy transition discussions in Brussels over the last number of years, that probably quite a few of us are coming into this room with their own very clear ideas as to how the energy transition is going to work. You might have different ideas, but some of you have fairly clear ideas on it. And what I would ask for the next hour and a half that we're together talking about this important topic, that we try and put some of these fixed ideas to one side, at least temporarily, and we go into this discussion with a sense of curiosity and a bit of humility and openness as well. Because I think predicting the future and how the future should go is difficult at the best of times, but the degree of complexity in energy systems and the energy transition is sometimes it feels like it's on another level. I mean, there's a huge technical basis to it. We can talk about the relative efficiencies of the different technological solutions, but then you start talking about what the cost reduction pathways are going to be, and all of a sudden that becomes very unclear. There's different networks, how they come into play, how these costs will be allocated as well. And then there's more fundamental questions like, which should we do? Should we go for the cost-effective approach where we focus on a small number of solutions? But what does that do in terms of exposing ourselves to diversity as well and resilience? So as I mentioned, we need to approach this with a degree of humility and openness because there's huge technical challenges associated with the energy transition. But we also need to choose as well. We need to make coordinated choices or collective choices about where we go with the energy transition as well. And that means humans, which comes with our own irrational approaches. We have a herd mentality. We tend to cluster around a few simple solutions. We're averse to risk, and lobbying, obviously, and people having different interests can lead to lock-in as well. And we know there's a politics dimension to this as well. There may be optimal solutions from an economic point of view, but they're going to help some more than they're going to help others. So these things we all need to factor into the study. And that means that there is no study that's going to give us a slam dunk solution. There is no one technology that is going to solve all our problems. And just as much, there is no one individual, no matter how smart or knowledgeable they might be, that can say with absolute certainty how the transition is or should unfold. And what I would say is anyone who claims that to you with 100% certainty is perhaps not being honest with themselves, or certainly not with yourselves as well. So with that spirit of humility and trying to find the solutions between us rather than within individuals, I do want to see who we have in the room, so that can help with some of the questions in the background. If I could just have a show of hands for those of you who would say you work for a representative association. So it could be an industry, it could be a trade association, it could be a chamber of commerce. Hands up. Okay, a good 20% in the room. I'm from a more think tank background. A few think tankers there as well. NGOs. Okay, we've got one person representing the NGOs today. Who else have we got? Consultants. Quite a few. Media. I guess I'd put up my hand for that as well. And then from public institutions. Okay, because I am interested in the representation from the public institutions as well, because maybe that's one part of the picture we don't have on the panel as well. So if you do have questions or comments at the end, particularly those of you who work in the Commission, obviously speaking from your own personal perspective as well, do jump in. We'd be very interested in hearing how you do. So just some logistical points. As I mentioned, this session is recorded. It's not being live streamed, so I think you signed up for that at the start. When we go for questions, we'll have a roving mic. My colleague at the back of the room will bring it through. So when we go for questions, just put up your hands and I'll spot you and direct a mic towards you. Okay, I think that's enough for me. Let's move on to the substance of the event, the presentation of the study by Frontier Economics. And I'd like to bring to the stage Stefan Rentic, first of all, who's a manager with Frontier Economics. And he will shortly be joined by Christoph Gatzen, a director at Frontier Economics, to present the results. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Is the sound okay? Okay, very good. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity here to present some of the main findings of our study after more than a year of hard work and a lot of internal discussions. I think we have quite some interesting findings that I will start to present and later hand over to my colleague Christoph. So before talking about the findings, I want to give an introduction of what the objectives and the approach of our study were. So we want to obviously contribute to the discussion of what a successful energy transition could look like. And we are looking at a cost-efficient solution of how we can reach our decarbonization targets. And that was said in the introduction. We are looking at what role low carbon and renewable gases can play in this energy transition. And our approach is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we're starting from well-established sources, external studies that we use as a starting point, and then add our own bit to the analysis. And the two main factors that differentiates us from other studies are that we are really technology open. So we are taking all available decarbonization options into account. And the second point is that we are taking into account that we might encounter some setbacks on the transition. So we might have some expectations of how the future might develop. They might not materialize, and we are looking at these scenarios as well and see what we can do to still reach our decarbonization targets. We do this by using our Frontier Comet model, which is an energy system model for the whole European energy system, and that optimizes the energy supply side, so investments in power plants, in electrolyzers, in batteries, and also optimizes the trade between regions and the import of fuels from outside the European region. So this is the starting point. And then I have to introduce you to the scenario framework to give a bit of background of what we are actually doing. So the idea is, as I said, we're starting from a well-established scenario. So we're looking at the TYNDP, the 10-year network development plan that was published earlier this year. And we use it as a starting point for a lot of our assumptions, for example, for the baseline scenario. So that's really our main scenario to begin with. We use the TYNDP for the assumptions regarding the development of final demand, but also for a bunch of other assumptions regarding availability of imports of hydrogen potentials for the build out of renewables, wind and solar, and so on. Where possible, we are deviating from the TYNDP assumptions and just using more recent, more updated data where available. We are aware that the TYNDP scenarios are not perfect. For example, there are some problems with data consistency of historical data. And also you can debate if the assumptions that have been made for the transition of the final demand side are always reasonable. But we think, given that is a well-established study. It has a lot of transparency regarding the assumptions. It went through a public consultation process and has to be confirmed by the European Commission that this is a very good starting point for our analysis. But then when we looked at the scenario, we thought, okay, there are some assumptions that might not materialize, that are the setbacks that I was talking about earlier. And there are three main areas that we looked at. So we're saying, okay, what happens? So these are then our what-if scenarios. So first, what-if scenario, what happens if we cannot reach our energy efficiency targets? So if we end up in a world where we have more final energy demand that are projected in this scenario. Second, what happens if we end up in a world where we cannot build out our renewables, wind and solar in particular, as fast as is assumed in the scenarios? And third, what happens if we have a delay in grid expansion? How can we still manage to reach our decarbonisation targets? And for all of these four scenarios, so the baseline and the three what-if scenarios, we look at two different variations of the world. So the first variation is that we say, okay, how can we reach our targets if we have renewable gases available? And with renewable gases, I'm referring to the import potential of green hydrogen, the domestic production of green hydrogen, and the biomethane potential to produce biomethane domestically. So if we have these gases available, what would the world look like? How can we reach our targets? And what does the world look like if we cannot access these renewable gases? Or what's the difference between the two? And finally, we complemented the analysis by also looking at a high electrification scenario, which is based on the T by NDP distributed energy scenario, to see if our findings also hold in a different world, different development for final demand. So, but now I want to come to some main findings of our analysis. So first focusing on the baseline and the what-if scenarios. On the slides, you can see the development of final demand. So on the left side, we have a baseline scenario, which again is largely based on the global ambition scenario for T by NDP. And on the right side, you have the what-if scenario with higher demand, where we basically assume that we have less advances in energy efficiency, but also higher activity levels in the transportation and in the industrial sector. So even in the baseline, or when you first look at the baseline scenario, you see that we have a strong decline of final demand that is assumed by 30% in the frame 2019 to 2050. And even in our what-if scenario, we have a strong decline of 18% over the same period. But the first thing that's very interesting to notice is when you then look at the gases, that the actual consumption of gases is increasing. And I'm talking here about the combined consumption of methane and hydrogen, which despite the trend in overall decline of energy consumption, it's increasing even in absolute numbers. And we see that for total gas consumption, we have an increase of 15% in our baseline scenario and 36% in our what-if scenario. Of course, you see there's a shift. So in 2019, there was hardly any hydrogen in the final demand mix. And you see this is changing over time. Hydrogen is increasingly replacing the consumption of methane. But overall, I think that's the first important statement to see that even if we have all this transition, and when you look around, you have all this talk about electric heating, heat pumps in households, electric cars, still in this external scenario you see, you could still expect a significant increase of gas consumption until 2050. Okay, but where is this gas then coming from? So first we looked only at the final consumption, but then we looked at the general fuel categories, methane and hydrogen. But what exactly can we do? How exactly is this energy supplied in a cost-efficient way? And this slide is now showing our baseline scenario results in the scenario where we assume a high availability of renewable gases. And here you have a breakdown of what types of gases are actually used to supply final demand. On the bottom, you have the two main energy carriers for methane, which is biomethane and natural gas. And on top of it, in the light blue area, the patterned area, you have blue hydrogen, and on top of that, you have green hydrogen or power to hydrogen production with electrolyzers. But starting with the hydrogen part. We see at the beginning, or we expect in this cost-efficient way, that until 2030, we will have to rely to a large extent on blue hydrogen, which is like steam methane reforming using natural gas in combination with CCS to produce hydrogen. And only in the medium to long term, meaning 2040 and 2050, we see then increasing shares of power to hydrogen, green hydrogen, because only then we have necessary capacities of renewables, low-cost renewables, wind and solar available that we can then use to produce green hydrogen. And actually that's something we see over all of our scenarios, that we have very efficient or very cost-efficient synergies between variable renewables and electrolyzers. Because you have a lot of hours where you have a lot of renewable generation, we see a huge increase of variable renewables, and to actually be able to integrate these renewables in the system, making them available when and where they are needed, we need then the electrolyzers and the green hydrogen production. Looking at the gas side, at the methane side, you see that we have an increasing share of biomethane in the system. That's also something that we see consistently over the scenarios, that biomethane has a very valuable contribution to decarbonizing final energy demand. It's used in combination with carbon capture and storage, so it's creating the negative emissions that we are needing to reach our decarbonization targets. Natural gas, you can see it's decreasing for the consumption and final demand, but it's still valuable for the production of blue hydrogen. In combination again with CCS, we can use natural gas to make it available in a decarbonized way, and it's still part of the cost-optimal mix. But talking about costs, so now here in this slide you can see the cost differences that we calculated for the scenarios where you have this high availability of renewable gases compared to the world where we don't develop our potential for renewable gases, and see how much money we can actually save if we now put the right policies in place. And we are now looking at the energy supply side, so the difference in costs are now difference in investment costs for power plants, for example, for electrolyzers, investments in renewables, but also costs for carbon capture, for example, or imports of fuels from outside of Europe. And you see that over all scenarios you have a significant impact. You can save significant costs if you have these renewable gases available. In our scenarios we calculated up to 540 billion euros that you can save over the period 2030 to 2050. And especially in the scenario where we constrain the build out of the renewables, wind and solar, we see the biggest impact. And that's just because in this scenario it's particularly difficult to reach decarbonization targets. There we would have to rely on immature, expensive technologies like direct air capture, and having then the renewable gases available as a substitute, then this can really make a difference in costs. But not only the costs are, of course, largely different, we also see that even in prices. So when looking at the marginal costs of our model, which reflects the impact on wholesale prices, you see that we also have a significant impact of the electricity and hydrogen costs in the future, seeing up to 21% cost reduction or price reduction for electricity, 30% for hydrogen. This is also again in the scenario where you constrain the renewables build out, which obviously also makes a huge difference then for end consumers or for the competitiveness of the industry if we can keep costs low or prices low. And then I will hand over to Christoph.
Yes, so we are not just presenters, we are also now looking at the different scenario. As Stefan said, we also looked at the distributed energy scenario, which is the second main scenario in the TUBA NDP, in order to see how robust our findings are. And if you look at the scenario, I think the decentralized energy scenario is characterized by an even higher energy efficiency gains, which means more isolation, more electrification of the society. It also has some assumptions concerning behavioral changes, so people use more public transport, have cold heating, and a little bit less industrial or GDP activity in the system. And if you add that to the scenario mix, you can add about 6% additional final energy demand savings, which is roughly the size of Belgium. But it's not just the only change that we lower the demand, we also increase the electricity demand in this scenario. And this means that we have a higher system load of about 80 gigawatts of peak electricity demand across Europe, which is about the peak demand of Germany. So this is the second scenario. And then we looked, okay, what in this world, which is what we would say a high electrification world with high energy efficiency assumptions, but still in this world, we have a significant role of these gases. We are, in relative terms, having more gas in the system, in this high electrification system than we have today, 27 instead of 22%, but obviously from a smaller overall final energy demand. And in absolute numbers, we have a little bit less gases in the system than we consume today. It's like 82% of today's gas consumption in a very high electrification scenario. So this already shows the need for the renewable and low carbon gases in the scenarios which we call the more balanced ones. It's up to 15%, 30% more than today. But even in this world, what we see highly optimistic in terms of efficiency gains and electrification. Even in this scenario, you only have slightly less gas consumption than today. What is the mix? You see it's a similar picture what Stefan showed. So the overall consumption of low carbon and renewable gases on the long run is 2,500 terawatt hours compared to the 3,200 Stefan showed. Again, hydrogen is one of the key contributors. What's quite interesting here is that we have a strong role of power to hydrogen or green hydrogen as kind of a natural partner to volatile renewables. In this scenario, we have situations where we have more than 600 gigawatts of electricity from wind and solar production, which is higher than the demand in that hour. So we have 600 gigawatts of electricity flying around, which we don't use in normal demand application, which we have to pick up with batteries or with power to hydrogen. And then we have also the dark doldrum periods where we need, again, hydrogen to provide backup for the electricity system. So it's kind of like a twin or symbiosis that you have the hydrogen and the PTX in combination with the electrified world. And that is one of the drivers, the electricity system, that you have a strong use of power to hydrogen in this high electrification scenario. Again, biomethane, it will be used. It's a kind of a low cost option for the green gases. And again, it will be used in combination with CCS to generate negative emissions. We also did an indicative cost comparison between the two scenarios. It's an indication because, as we have seen before, the models are quite sensitive to assumptions and a lot of complex analysis. But I think the message is very robust. So what we did, we compared what are the total costs of decarbonization if I take the baseline compared to the high electrification scenario. And obviously, in the high electrification scenario, you have a lower final energy demand, which we have just shown. And that means the cost for the energy itself is cheaper than in the baseline. We just need less energy. Obviously, this is cheaper, even though the electricity system is probably a little bit less efficient than in the baseline system, because we have surpluses and backup and batteries and all this stuff and power lines. But overall, we save money on the energy side. But, and this is the big thing we have to consider, we have a lot of cost in the end-use appliances. So if you compare the costs for isolation, the cost for the heat pumps, the cost for electric vehicles, everything in which is kind of end-use appliance at the user end, this has to be also compared and has to be part of the picture. I save on the energy side, on the OPEX, but I pay more on the CAPEX side to isolate my house or to buy an electric car instead of a hydrogen car, for example, or truck. The truck is probably more relevant. And if you add these costs up, and then you deduct the cost for the energy saving, you end up with net system cost increases in the high electrification scenario of about 550 billion euros over 20 years. And these costs don't even include distribution network costs or differences in industrial activity. So in a nutshell, we can say a more balanced approach to decarbonization saves us costs compared to a high electrification approach. So to sum up, we think that the renewable and low carbon gases are a very important part of the puzzle, and they are an essential part of the successful transition alongside electrification. So it's not an either or, it's a combination. To answer Donagh's question, is it a combination or either or? We think it has to go hand in hand. It is a cost-efficient and resilient solution. We have seen it in the cost comparison I shown, but it's also shown in the what-if scenarios which Stefan presented, that we need to have a plan B, and if something doesn't work out as planned with our electrification, we have the green molecules to step in, so we don't miss our targets, or we don't have to rely on direct air capture, which is not so mature and still very expensive. We can then rely on the renewable and low carbon gases, which are part of plan A and can be our insurance if we miss some of the electrification targets. This is basically our findings, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
And Christoph, I think, a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs to take in, but I think one of the core messages is that, using this diversified approach with low carbon and renewable gases is more resilient and cheaper is one of the core conclusions from the study. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. So if I could ask Korina Grajecki to come up, who is the Director for European Affairs with Utility Engie, or Engie. Renaud Battier, who's the Director General of Ceramuni, the Ceramics Industry Association. Raphaël Onoteux, the E3G's Senior Policy Advisor. And myself. So the way I like to start these discussions is to ask all the panelists, why are you here? And it's a bit of a direct question in some senses, but it's a great way of just finding out for each of the people who's opted to come, why they decided to come, obviously, but what their interests are and why they believe this is an important topic. So we might start with yourself, Korina. Why are you here?
Thanks a lot. I love that question because it's very easy to answer. Does it work? Yeah. It's very easy to answer because you just said very well. The summary of the study is it's not either or, it's both. It's all of the decarbonisation levers that we need to activate, and that is what we very strongly believe at Engie. We are really committed to the energy transition, to decarbonisation, with taking into account all levers, meaning electrons and molecules alike. And that is why we are so happy about the study, because it also comes at a very important point in time. Of course, we are all waiting for the final confirmation of the new European Commission. We are waiting for a clean industrial deal. We are in a context where every second sentence in Brussels starts with Draghi says, and I will do the same, saying we need to bring competitiveness and decarbonisation together, and renewable and low carbon gases are the perfect way of doing that, because it's about reducing the cost of the energy transition while pushing forward, while keeping up the ambition, but in the most cost optimal way. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm happy to discuss with you.
Great, thank you. And moving on to Renaud, why are you joining us today?
Thank you. So the first reason is because you have invited me. And I suppose you have invited me because the ceramic industry is quite a significant gas consumer, 6 billion cubic meters per year. And also because our roadmap is saying that we need a diversified approach. So maybe this is why we were invited. And we gladly accepted because we think this is a very important question, a huge challenge for our industry. And for an industry, we're also here to say that this industry that is maybe not as known as some bigger consumers is also very important. So we represent many different ceramic sectors that you need for housing. So bricks, roof tiles, ceramic tiles, sanitary ware, clay pipes, expanded clay, and the list continues. But we are less known for something even more important for any manufacturing, which is refractory materials, what we call refractory ceramics. So in any steel furnace, in chemicals, in the production of energy, in waste incineration, in glass, in cement, you will have a kiln, and in this kiln, it doesn't work without refractory ceramics. So you can say 100% of steel is made with refractory ceramics. So there is no transition without refractory ceramics. And then we have technical ceramics, which you find absolutely everywhere in cars, in batteries, in windmills, in aerospace, ceramic layers on satellites, etc. So it's very, very broad. And we are very strong in Europe. We are representing 200,000 employees. So it is very important to them also that we find a solution for the energy transition. A lot of SMEs as well, and what is very specific to us, we all think that we are specific, of course, but is that we have a lot of installations that are remote. So just in the ETS, for example, ETS 1, we have more than 1,000 installations, but we represent only, this is 10% of all the ETS installations, but we represent only 1% of the CO2 emissions. So we are very, very diffuse. And for us, it makes all these solutions extremely difficult because we are remote and because it depends on all these technologies. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's why we are here today.
Makes sense. And Raphael?
Yes, thank you, Donagh. Just a few words about E3G. For those who do not know, we're a climate change think tank. Our mission is really trying to advocate for a safe climate for all. And what that means is that we are looking at research, at science-based, also projections and modeling. So I have a lot of thoughts about the study, but I'm not really here to bring my technical discussion about the study. It's more also to bring back a bit of politics into that question and into the discussion that we have here today. Because if we take a step back a bit on the world that it is today, where the EU is in 2024, with the new commission that we have here, also with the elections that we just had in the US, we can see that geopolitics are kind of back in the menu. It's a very different world than the assumptions or the things that we could have thought a few years ago prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, also the energy crisis, which was related but not only based on this, and now the new developments. When I'm looking at that, I'm quite interested to see this whole debate about gas and the energy transition in general and electrification. And gases are well, gas and decarbonized gas. We had a gas package for most of the last 3 or 4 years. They have a role to play. It's very important. But I think to a certain extent, what I would really want to avoid is this idea that we have a competition between gas and electricity. For us, at least at E3G, when we look at the modeling, we look at what's going on, we really see that gas should be used as an enabler of more electrification and more renewable penetration into the energy system, rather than trying to see what's the, where gas can take the place of electrification. And I think that is really the way we need to think about things. It's really how do we enable more energy efficiency, more flexibility, and more electrification in general. And so that's also why I'm a bit puzzled sometimes when I see that, this study also argues that for the most of, well, by 2050, we'll still be very much reliant on fossil gas, whether be it, using it for blue hydrogen or with CCS or any other options, but it doesn't really foresee any kind of phase out of or phase down even of fossil gas use or gas use in general, which is a bit puzzling because it feels that the momentum right now is really much on independence and resilience, and this I find it difficult to advocate with relying on foreign suppliers and also on exogenous reserves and resources.
Okay. Thanks, Raphael. I think we'll come back to that question as well. Christoph, I guess we know why you're here because you've got this study to share with the world, but maybe taking a step back as to why you took this study or why you felt this was a topic that was worth digging into and giving some quantitative figures about.
Yes, thank you. So I think what our role is here to bring some facts and a little bit cross-sector expertise to the debate. And if you just step back a bit and you think where we are, our decarbonization just has started. We have a renewable share of about 25%, which means 75 to go. we have to replace the solid fuels like coal and lignite. We have to replace many of the oil-based products. So there's a long way to go. And we made some good progress in the electrification part, but the electrification sector is 25% of our power sector. So, and it's already kind of challenging what we have seen, and the electricity sector is probably the most complex energy chain of all. So we have to have the same amount of electricity in the system as we consume in any millisecond in the whole network. So it's a super complex system. And then we have to, and we want to throw the other 75% on the 25. So it's probably not working. And if you just look at some of the numbers, whatever, they are a little bit up and down, but depends on the scenario. But in general, we have to add about 2,000 gigawatts of wind and solar, which is factor 7 in PV, factor 4 in wind onshore, and factor 25 in offshore. We want to add about 300 gigawatts of battery and power plants. We are not even able to build 10 in Germany currently with a Kraftwerkstrategie. And we have to have built thousands of kilometers of lines. So we don't see, we embrace the electrification, but we don't see how that is possible with almost only electrification. So I'm fully with you. We need both pillars and also with you. The good thing, as we have shown, is with the renewable gases, they are quite helpful in various ways. We can use them to replace some of the fossils, so we have to see whether we have the same understanding. In our scenario, the fossil methane is replaced in various forms. We use blue hydrogen because it's a cost-efficient way, and given your case, we think it's very important to be pragmatic and technology open, and also use the technologies which are cheaper, but probably not the super shinest and brightest technology. And then we will see the green hydrogen when it's there. We can use it on the long run, and it's going to be cheaper anyway. So we don't have to worry that we have a lock-in or something there. We also have the symbiosis. I don't know if you mentioned it, I think, that we have a lot of hours where we have too much electricity. So energy efficiency first sounds nice, but we have hundreds or thousands of hours in the future where we have hundreds of gigawatts more electricity than we need. So we have to do something with it. And power to X, power to hydrogen, is a way of making use of wind and solar in a better way, which, by the way, increases the business case for wind and solar. So they get better prices on the power exchange, and we have the hydrogen rather than taking the wind farm out of the wind. Much better thing. We have also question about storage and transport to give you some facts about that. So an extra high voltage line, which you know outside, the huge towers, they are like 1 to 2 gigawatts of capacity. If you have a 1 diameter pipeline, it's 15 to 30 gigawatts of energy which can be just run through this line. So factor 10 to 15 more. And the costs are about 2 to 8 times lower if you transport a kilowatt hour of gas than a kilowatt hour of electricity. Another reason why we need this green gases. And then we also have to think about what do we need in electrification? We need millions of individual investment decisions. So people have to renovate their houses, they have to buy heat pumps, they have to buy electric vehicles, industry has to buy heat pumps. So super complicated, and we have to do something for the stock. We see already people are not taking up the heat pumps. Yeah? The German heat pump strategy will not be reached. The German targets for electric vehicles will not be reached. So we have to have something to decarbonize for people who don't buy a new end-use appliance. We have to address the building stock, and we have to have something for process heat. I think one discussion which we can make is who uses the hydrogen in the end, and we think that exactly, especially process heat, has no solution yet. And then finally, from a perspective of a portfolio manager, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So every banker doesn't go for one share, he buys an ETF or a portfolio. So we should kind of make sure that we are hedged in our energy transition way of doing it. And I think your point is also important. We need to think about competitiveness of European industry. I think whatever solution we take, there will be extra costs which we have to cope on the short run. There will be savings on the long run. And we have to think how that fits into global competition. So we are talking about CBAM, cross-border adjustment mechanism, or carbon border adjustment mechanism. And we have also think about where can we take the cheap fuels. So I think here I'm a different opinion as you, that I think we should use of comparative advantage of international trade to get green hydrogen from regions which have better wind and solar. And we are still, for example, in fuels, we are already like mineral oil products. We are depending on a few numbers of people who can deliver the fuel. With green hydrogen, it's a much broader way of potential parties we can team up with. For example, the German Chancellor was in Namibia, which we never had as a trading partner for oil. So I think there are much more options on international trade where you can get the fuels from, if you have the infrastructure. And that is my last point. We have to have a different attitude to infrastructure. Energy infrastructure, both the wind farms, but also the pipelines, the power lines, the distribution network also in gas, they are the basis of economic activity and our wealth. We can't have the NIMBY and make only as much infrastructure as you need. We need infrastructure for our economic success. And these are hopefully the points which we contribute with our study. Thank you.
Very brief follow-on question, and I think this was kind of littered through your remarks, but in the study, there were 3 scenarios. There was a low energy efficiency, or low energy efficiency improvements, we should say.
Wow, it's still very ambitious.
Less ambitious, let's say. There was the less ambitious renewables rollout, and then there was the issues with the grid deployments. Which scenario do you think is the most likely? Which is the
I would say, for me, the most likely is the balance high demand scenario, because I don't see that we get the energy efficiency gains which we want. In the scenarios, we have a insulation rate of about 3%. Reality is less than 1.
The energy efficiency is focused on buildings primarily.
Yeah, buildings are a huge driver of energy demand, I think. Yeah.
Okay. As a moderator and as a journalist, this is a bit of a conundrum, because everybody's very much in agreement on most points, and the agreement is that you need a mix of everything. So it's hard to find the tension and the conflict there, but I'll see what I can get out of it anyway. Rafael from E3G had particular concerns with the use of blue hydrogen, and I think they were still in the scenarios even in 2050. I mean, maybe Corinne, it's a question for you, for ENGIE, who has a focus on natural gas. What role do you see for blue hydrogen, and what would you say to those who have concerns that we're locking in the use of fossil fuels?
Well, I fully understand that question, and I think we need to discuss it. But I think we need to be careful is not locking in our discussion in something that will bring us nowhere. Because when we again take this bigger picture, we are in a situation where we, as ENGIE, we have published our decarbonisation pathway to 2050 just 2 days ago. And according to our findings, well, the findings of my very smart colleagues in Paris, we will get to 2030 55% emissions reduction target. That's in reach. But will we get to 2050? That is much more challenging. And that is mainly because 70% of the technologies we will need to decarbonize heavy transport, heavy industry, all of that is not yet so mature and at least not used at industrial scale. So having that in mind, what we believe is that now we have to use all the options and should not lose ourselves in very dogmatic discussions on how and which percentage of natural gas we still have in 2040 or in 2050. Nobody knows. Things are moving extremely fast, but what we know is that we want to go towards renewable gases, towards biomethane. That is something we work a lot on at ENGIE, which is totally underrated, unfortunately, in many member states and European level. But even if we say, okay, the direction of travel is renewable gases, we know that where we are at the moment this is a very frustrating situation, because this market is not kicking off. It's not ramping up. Projects are delayed, are stopped. This is just not happening as fast as we wanted to. So we need low carbon hydrogen for various reasons, but also for helping to develop renewable gases, because we need the volumes, we need this market to kick off now, and also to incentivize infrastructure. So that's why we really think, let's be pragmatic, let's have both options open. And for now, and those of us here in the Brussels bubble, we always are into those delegated acts and things like that. We have now on the table a delegated act on low carbon hydrogen. So we have now the chance to do something very pragmatic and to speed up the process. Because all we see is that the next few years will be decisive in investments. We need to take the investments decisions as ENGIE, as all the companies in the sector. And we need to do this now, and we need to quickly speed up. So that's why we really call for pragmatism and speed and openness. And let's not discuss too far in advance. Let's not discuss about tiny percentages, but really speed everything up, use all the levers now. And for me, again, I'm coming back to the Clean Industrial Deal. It's really a test case for Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission if this is for real. Because if you want a clean industrial deal, you have to have a pragmatic framework for both low carbon hydrogen and renewable hydrogen. And that also would mean that you have to open up the rules for renewable hydrogen, because we just see they are too strict. It's not happening. We need to work on that.
Maybe just one follow-up question before I give the floor to Raphael to respond. Blue hydrogen, do you see it as does ENGIE see it as a transition or like an end state?
It has a big transition role, but it's also to a certain degree there to stay. Yeah, but it's not about discussing the percentage and the relation of that. It's about enabling that we actually can start this transition. Because at the moment, we are really stuck, and that is worrying us.
Raphael, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, with pleasure. Yes, so I completely agree. We shouldn't look at the tiny details or a few percentage. And I'm also not here to say my crystal ball is better than your crystal ball. It's really not the aspect. But I think we should go back to a few fundamentals. When we look at the costs of renewable at the moment, we see a very strongly declining line. We see that cost of solar, wind, battery storage, everything is going down quite quickly, and it's quite difficult to argue that it will come back up. When we look at the cost of fossil fuels, we know that inherently we are exposed to volatility of the geopolitical developments, the Red Sea situation, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Eastern Europe. All of that has very strong impacts on the price of fossil fuels. And when we look at, again, not looking at the tiny details, but just looking at the global pathway, where roughly do we want to land by 2050? We see that I'm a little bit worried when I read this study, or when I listen to this, about a message that would say we will stay hooked on fossil fuel until the foreseeable future, in 2050 and beyond. Of course, you can talk about CCS or anything, but you need the gas from somewhere, and then you're very much exposed to the volatility, but also just to the dependency that we create. And we create dependencies with Azerbaijan. We stop dependencies with Russia. It's probably a good thing. But now we are also very much dependent on gas from the US, from Donald Trump, who is also a character that will probably not hesitate to use it politically and not only think about this in purely economic terms. So I find it very increasing our vulnerability and very worrying to see kind of this pathway and this kind of horizon for Europe. And maybe just to get back on the question of cost and volatility, I think it's interesting to say, okay, blue hydrogen could be a transition fuel before green hydrogen. I'm also happy that you kind of evoked the idea that hydrogen volumes that we were talking about 2 or 3 years ago are now in the projections really much smaller. The 20 million tons by 2030 is really something that no one really believes here, I think. So there is kind of a hype on hydrogen that kind of died down. I still find a few of these traces of this hype in the study. And what I would want to say is that when we talk about blue hydrogen, the most recent study talk a lot about methane leakage. You know, there is the global methane pledge, there is a methane regulation. We need to address methane leakage all along the value chain because this is a reality. Except for Norway, a lot of other producers really struggle with this. But if you really think that we need to address that, if producers address that, you will also have a problem of cost. Basically, the cost that we had from piped Russian gas is never going to come back. It's always going to be more expensive than that. And if we think about blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, imported conversion losses, all of that really paint a picture on cost that is really not helpful. And maybe just to finish, if we consider that we will still import quite a lot of methane for whatever reason to make blue hydrogen or CCS by 2050, we should also think that, by 2049, the gas package regulation prohibits long-term contracts with producers to import fossil gas. So we should really think, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean that the regulation has to be changed? Does that mean that we will only procure gas on spot prices, which again exposes us to a lot of volatility? I'm really worried about this cost trajectory because nothing really makes the math go right.
This is one this is definitely one for lunch later on for sure. I think we could spend all day talking about this. But I think there was a point from Karina which I thought was particularly interesting. It's this idea of uncertainty and how that stops us from doing things now. And I think that's a nightmare for a policymaker in terms of getting things moving now and making sure you're in the right direction for the optimal outcome, and probably something that needs to be worked through. I think from your opening remarks, Renaud, I think you seem to have an advantage, as in it's very clear where you need to go, right?
I'm not sure. Yes. Yeah, in fact, we came to the same conclusion as this study in 2021, but we didn't need to do a study. We had several input or studies at national level. And indeed, our conclusion we decided to build the whole roadmap on the assumption that we would achieve our decarbonization roadmap through energy efficiency measures, so by reducing to about 200,000 terajoule our need, and then all the other effort had to be by replacing natural gas by something else. And we decided based on all these inputs, and these inputs depend on the grid capacity, the evolution of the grid, the capacity in production of renewable hydrogen in biogas, and then a lot of combination of national regulations that prevent us sometimes to use biogas. For example, if we have a huge cluster with 300 sites, we cannot use biomass because there is too much emission in the air. We have to face with all these different national and regional contexts. So then when we put everything together, we came to the conclusion we will base it on 1/3 green electricity, 1/3 biogas, and 1/3 green hydrogen. And then we have different processes, some that are at 800 degrees, 1,200, or 2,000, and then the solution is different as well. And it becomes the higher you go in temperature, the more difficult it can be with electricity. So this is why we came to that conclusion. But it's not an advantage because what is common in all these technologies is that they are not available today, or they are too volatile. And the very first thing that I want to mention is you were talking about predictability, and Corinna talked about urgency. And we think that the Draghi report makes an excellent diagnosis and shows really the urgency in the scale of the deindustrialization and the pace that we are experiencing today, to what extent we are completely uncompetitive. So for us, today we have a price of gas at 45 euros per megawatt. Our competitors in the US, they have 9. And most of our competitors, they are between 5 and 10. So whenever you assess the feasibility of transition based on electrification or decarbonized gas, then you need to take that into account. This is your reference. Can you compete at the international level?
Maybe.
And then electricity is 2 to 3 more expensive than natural gas, and hydrogen 3 to 5 times for us. So we play with these rules, and then we have so various projects are everywhere in our industry on electrification or hydrogen. But when we want to switch to electricity, we can because the grid is completely saturated. For example, in the Netherlands, Or if there is a hydrogen valley, we go and see them. In fact, the whole hydrogen valley would only satisfy one small plant in the ceramic industry. So this is the situation today, and we need to change that very quickly.
Okay, so not 100% certainty anyway, still a few decisions to be made.
Zero certainty, and for SMEs it's a killer. And we are adding, so the cost is too high, and the unpredictability is increasing every day with the changes in ETS, ETS2. We have at least 500 installations in ETS2, and in fact we don't have a clue of how many will be. And they can face a price of 100 euros, and they don't even know today if I don't tell them.
I have one follow-up question, and then I know the guys have been sitting here very patiently. I want to give them a chance to input as well. I guess the ceramics industry has been hit by deindustrialization as well and international competitive pressures. This idea of reindustrializing via decarbonisation, I mean, are your members, it makes a lot of sense here in Brussels, but does that reassure your members? I mean, I presume there's going to be cost increases in the short term.
So, I'm sorry, what should be reassuring for us?
This idea that decarbonisation of industry in Europe can revitalise and allow us to regain our competitive position vis-à-vis international competitors.
Well, we moved to natural gas in the 80s because it was the cleanest fossil fuel. And it was very, it was good for to have a high rate of productivity, and it was predictable at the time. And today, for us, of course, we are always working on energy efficiency. We would work on it anyways because it's a cost. But substituting gas cannot be seen as an advantage. It's a huge challenge. And challenge in capital expenses and in operational expenses. And the challenge for us, because I mentioned that we have so many SMEs and small installations, is that we don't have access to many of the solutions. So our CO2 is too small for CCS to be a solution, in most cases, with some exceptions. Then we don't have access to carbon contracts for difference. We don't have access to power purchasing agreements. In practice, this situation today. So for us, what would be reassuring would really to have an instrument, a focus, some strategy that would focus on gas-intensive and remote installations and SMEs. We have heard some in the recent declarations, the Budapest, and also in the hearings of Mr. Séjourné. We heard about traditional industries, so it's not only traditional. In our case, it's also remote and dependent on so many solutions. So it's not one big site in the cement industry. You find a solution for this one, and then that helps. For us, it's 200 sites for one company sometimes.
Okay, so I think something to absolutely bear in mind, the experience on the ground as we in Brussels start talking about a clean industrial strategy in the next 100 days of the Commission. Very quickly, and then I want to bring the audience in, Karina.
Yes, sorry. I promise we keep the rest for the lunch debate, but just a very quick reaction on what you said, Raphael. So maybe just for the sake of clarity, ENGIE is also very much pushing electrification. That's maybe not often so known, but we are a very big investor in renewable electrification. Pretty much everywhere in Europe, we even have electricity grids outside Europe, but that's really an important part. We had 60% of our earnings in on the electricity side. So very much agree that we need to go forward with electricity. But there you have the same challenges of dependence and new dependencies maybe with clean technologies. I mean, we had the whole discussion in the spring about solar panels coming from China. So, you know, in every decarbonization vector, you have those challenges, and we have to face them, we have to discuss them. We have a start of an answer with the Net Zero Industry Act, with the non-price criteria for renewables auctions. So they have these elements, but I just wanted to say you have the same discussions and challenges also in the electricity field and in every field actually.
Let's hear what the audience have to say about that and any other topics raised. So my colleague Sebastian is going around with a mic, so if you have a question or a comment, just raise your hand. The gentleman in the front, in the purple top. If you could just introduce yourself as well so we know who we're talking to.
Yes, hi, Robert McLeod from McLeod Consult. I work with a number of energy companies in the wind, solar, gas, nuclear field here in Brussels. Thank you for the very informative and interesting conversation. I just have a couple of questions just on clarity on the report. Just quickly, just first of all, when you're talking of the cost of hydrogen of 8 to 36 euros and electricity of 4 to 28 euros per megawatt hour, are they production costs or what you expect to see the market cost, market price of that energy? And when you're doing these, when you did your calculations over the last 12 months, did you account for, particularly with gas demand on, for example, fertilizer, gas demand for industry, for the chemical industry, also the Commission's decision that or comments recently that it wants to, diversify the 18% of gas that's currently supplied by Russia. Where does that come from? And also, over the last year, the Commission said that it wants to have AI processed in Europe, which again is like at minimum they're talking 15 to 20 gigawatts of extra capacity, of power capacity requirements. Are those things are they being reflected in your current pricing reports? Because it strikes me that the demand levels you're looking at seem to be a little bit optimistic, perhaps even on the low side.
As you said, there's a difference between cost and prices. No? So we have an energy system modeling cost, so it's kind of the marginal cost of the system, and then the average over the next 20 years, which is a very simple proxy towards prices. Now, in the real world, prices are different, as you say. It's a demand-supply question and so on. So it's a proxy of prices. On the demand projections, we have basically based the economic development on the assumptions which are based in the TYNDP, so how much methane is used, how much industrial activity will be in Europe. That can be seen, all the details in the ETM model and in the documentation of the TYNDP. There are sectors which have a strong decrease in GDP, for example, refineries. There are sectors which are increasing in their demand, which means there is still a high level of industrial activity within Europe. But it's based on a scenario or two scenarios in the end now, which were from the TYNDP, and they didn't include anything happening in the last 6 months or so. So that's not in there. But I think the overall trend is quite robust, and we have a wide range with picking two scenarios. So I think the key messages should be robust.
Any more questions in the room? Yes, gentleman in the yellow top.
Thank you. My name is Peter Bocek. I'm with the European Chemical Industry, CEFIC, in Brussels. Listening to the hearings of the commissioner designates and also looking at the Draghi report, one could come to the conclusion, well, we will get more of the same that we had in the past, like we are going to set some new targets for 2040 and then we will enforce that. And we will not most likely have the 800 billion Draghi suggests to throw at the European industry to support competitiveness. What is your expectation? Is it realistic to go on business as usual without that money, or what will be the realistic outcome? Thank you.
You didn't direct that question to anyone, but I think
yeah, maybe it's to all. Yeah.
Maybe we'll start with Rafael and then bring in Corinne afterwards.
Yeah. So I think that the Draghi report and the question around what will come out of the new commission in the first 100 days is really something that we all have in mind at the moment. I'm not sure if what the recommendations in the Draghi report are business as usual, if I understood your question correctly. I feel like it's asking for a bigger push for a faster transition, more heavily funded. So I think this is a political discussion that will also open up with the multi-annual financial framework, the EU budget discussion that we expect to start mid next year. And I feel like this would be a central piece of that discussion to see whether or not we basically stay on business as usual, or if we have this kind of new moment and this leap into more investment. The current politics of the EU at the moment are make it difficult to bet on this, but I think that would still be interesting. Just to pick up on what you said, you talked about the 2040 targets. It's very interesting and very I think fundamental. It might not be debated this year or the next. It's maybe something for later on in the Commission's mandate. But I do feel that we should have that in mind when we talk about this study or when we talk about the future of the energy systems. There was a very good impact assessment that was released in February this year about that. And it's a bit of a shame that we don't have the Commission here today because in many aspects, what we have in this study is absolutely at odds with the European Commission's impact assessment. And I'm not here to defend that impact assessment, but I do feel like there is a huge discrepancy in between the various options that are being laid on the table at the moment. So maybe it will be clarified next year or maybe after that, and probably the EU budget is going to be a key moment.
Karina?
Yeah, I agree that there are different studies and different impact assessments, but that's exactly that. And that is exactly also a bit the point where I would say, let's be careful with getting stuck into these discussions, but rather as an investor, as a company, rather let's really tackle the solutions as quickly as possible. And on the investments, yes, of course, the amounts that Draghi calls for, that seems very unlikely that this can happen out of a sudden. And unfortunately, it's also quite unlikely that in terms of public financing, there will be much more. I think what we can hope for and what we have to push, I think all of us, is a certain readjustment of to steer the actual fundings that are available really into the decarbonisation of industry and all of that. But yeah, that we have to see how that turns out. But from the perspective of a private investor, we need to improve the framework for private investments. So that means, again, I'm coming back to my little delegated acts and all those things. We need a pragmatic framework that we can actually take investment decisions. That's one thing. And then the other thing is really also to continue working and on those things that Draghi and Letta mentioned, and that is also part of the next mandate, hopefully, to get to the Capital Markets Union, for example, because we are also stuck. There could be much more money available to be invested into decarbonization if there were not still hurdles within the internal market. And those elements we also need to take into account. And we probably need to be a bit more innovative, and that is one of the points that we have highlighted also in our decarbonization pathway, is to think about private investments into infrastructure a bit more, because that would be possible. We might need here and there a regulatory change, but just be a bit more open in all directions to get at least some of the investments flowing that we will need.
I'm going to finish off by just taking a bit of a risk. Raphael, we heard, was interested in the Commission's experience. I think we do have a few policymakers in the room. Is there anyone who wants to take the mic and just give a bit of a perspective on how they are working through this almost impossible challenge of, on the one hand, keeping options open and having flexibility, and on the other hand, giving the certainty that investors need? Does anybody want to take the mic and just share their personal experience from within the institutions? Okay, no, this backfired in my face. I shouldn't have phrased the question so difficultly. Yeah, Christoph.
One answer on one of Raphael's point on the blue hydrogen. So I think, and your risk exposure to fossil prices. So I think there's a difference between the blue hydrogen world and the gas and the oil world in the past. I mean, I understand your point when you look at oil and OPEC, and there's a handful of countries where you can get the oil from, and they form a cartel. But now with blue hydrogen, it's more like an option. So, for example, with hydrogen, everyone who has a sunny desert or a windy coast can generate green hydrogen. You need a ship or a pipeline, and then you can sell it. And if you then exposed with blue hydrogen and you are more expensive than the green ones, you are out. If you're lower, you can serve the demand, and it's an option for economy to use low-cost hydrogen. So therefore, I see where you're coming from, no? And I understand that we don't want to be exposed to fossil price risk. But in that case, it's just a one-sided option for us. If it's more expensive and we don't need it, then we buy the green one. If we are scarce with the green one or it's more expensive, we can use the blue one. And I don't see why we shouldn't do it, especially if we then don't have a lock-in effect of the blue hydrogen in the long run, because we think that the green hydrogen will be cost efficient in the long run anyway. And then I'm with Angie saying, okay, then let's use some hydrogen so that we don't have just the pipelines there, because we need the pipelines to have liquid market and transparent market so people can do investment decision. If I think about investing into hydrogen production and I'm relying on exactly one potential client in my neighborhood, I'm probably not going to do it. But if I have a whole country or the whole continent which I can sell hydrogen to, I'm more open to take the risk and go for it. And I think that's what we need. We need the infrastructure, the networks, and then we need some liquid volumes in the market. And if it's cost efficient and increases liquidity, blue hydrogen has a value for me. And that's why we think it's part of the game. And the second thing is, we think biomethane is important. It can be cost efficient and it's domestic. So I think that's another pillar to get rid of this dependency, which you rightly fear.
Phil, if you want to respond, if you can do it in 30 seconds.
Yes. In 30 seconds. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I think it's also a bit difficult to mix green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. If we mix them, then we should not really see it as a commodity that we can kind of trade just like we traded methane. It's much more difficult to actually, ship hydrogen. You have conversion losses. It's way easier to do it with liquefying natural gas. So I think there is the first bit of a problem. The second problem really that I see, I understand what you're saying, that it's not exactly the same structure of dependency. But what I'm really worried when I read this or when I hear this is really to say we will be more resilient by being still dependent on fossil fuel. And I really don't see how we can really be more independent, more resilient, and more solid as the momentum is for in the Draghi report on what the keywords of the commissions are, by relying on fossil fuel. I really don't see these two coming together.
Okay, let's draw the line under this discussion now. We're 7 minutes late. I think, just to conclude, I think it was Teresa Ribera in her hearing during the week, towards the end, I think she almost got a bit frustrated, and she was kind of saying, a national minister to a room full of politicians, can we stop fighting over colours? And it feels like we tried not to, but we kind of ended up going there between pink, blue, green, hydrogen. It's probably something we're destined to keep on talking about, certainly in the months and years ahead, and even in the minutes and seconds ahead for lunchtime. So to wrap this up, I want to thank Karina, I want to thank Renaud, I want to thank Raphael, and I want to thank Christophe and Stefan as well. I want to thank Eurogas for pulling this all together. I hope you found it useful. Lunch is served outside. Thank you.